On October 28, 2023, the Louisiana Center for the Book in the State Library of Louisiana presented the 19th edition of the Louisiana Book Festival. Everybody Has a South, Grit Lit, featuring authors Frank Bill, Daren Dean, and Meagan Lucas, is only one of the outstanding programs featured at this event. Frank Bill is the New York Times best-selling author of The Ravaged with Norman Reedus. The novels The Savage and Donnybrook, the latter of which was turned into a film in 2018, and the story collection Crimes in Southern Indiana, one of GQ's favorite books of 2011 and a Daily Beast best debut of 2011. He lives and writes in Southern Indiana. Bill's featured work at the 2023 Louisiana Book Festival was the novel Back to the Dirt. Daren Dean is the author of Far Beyond the Pale, I'll Still Be Here Long After You're Gone, stories, The Black Harvest, a novel of the American Civil War, and This Vale of Tears. His short fiction has been nominated for the Pushcart Prize 3 times. His work has been nominated for the PEN/Faulkner, the W.Y. Boyd Literary Award for Excellence in Military Fiction, Midland's Author Award, and shortlisted for the Missouri Author Award. Dean's featured work at the festival was the novel Roads. Meagan Lucas is an award-winning author, editor, and teacher. Her debut novel, Songbirds and Stray Dogs, was North Carolina Center for the Book selection for the Route 1 Reads program. Lucas teaches creative writing at Robert Morris University and in the Great Smokies Writing Program at UNC Asheville. She is the editor-in-chief of Rec and Review. Lucas lives in the mountains of western North Carolina, and her work, featured at the festival, was the short story collection Here in the Dark. Ladies and gentlemen, the Louisiana Book Festival is proud to present this discussion of Grit Lit.
Well, hello, everyone. Thanks for coming. You mind if I...
No, go ahead and start.
Jump right in.
Basically, we don't have a moderator, so I think what we're going to do is kind of talk about where our work comes from, maybe our newest book,
Yeah.
and just go from there, dig into the roots of why we write what we write. And
That sounds good. My latest book's called Roads, and this is it. I brought a copy just so you can check it out. It's basically about a young girl that her name's Danny Lynn Posey, and her family is from a rural area, kind of into drugs and all kinds of bad things, you might say, And her sister disappears, and she thinks someone in another family that's into the same things as her family. They're kind of interrelated, like people tend to be in small towns and rural areas. You'll find out, hey, we're related. Your aunt's married to my cousin, and things like that. And that's kind of how these two families are, the Lynches and the Posies. And so she decides she's got to find out what happened to her sister because no one is talking. And that's essentially what it's about. And I know we were going to talk a little bit later about, well, what is Grit Lit? People always ask me, they go, what kind of stuff do you write? And I imagine it'd be easy if I could just say mystery, or if I just said some genre, horror. A lot of times I do say, I know if you talk to Southern writers, they'll do acrobatics to say, I'm not a Southern writer, because they don't like the label. But I don't mind saying Grit Lit. I write Grit Lit. But then the question becomes, what is Grit Lit? And then you start trying to explain it, and sometimes you get deer in the headlights looks. But maybe we can talk about that a little bit later.
Okay. Hi, I'm Meagan Lucas. I'm here today talking about my new short story collection. It's called Here in the Dark. I grew up on an island in the body of water between Lake Huron and Lake Superior, so I'm a Canadian expat, and I now live in the mountains of western North Carolina. And so my collection is really, I think, Grit Lit because it's rural. Because that's where I'm from. I grew up outside of a town of 300 people. And so, we want to maybe avoid definitions, I guess, of Grit Lit, but I think that sort of rural connection is something that ties us all together. And more often than not, though, I tell people that I write feminist crime fiction. because,
What kind of reaction does that give?
well, it depends where you are. In Asheville, where I live, it sells a lot of books. Other places, you get a look. But I like to explore social justice issues through genre fiction, right? Through crime or through horror, and I think that's fun to do. So, Frank.
Let's see here. My newest book, Back to the Dirt, is basically the culmination of my time working in a factory, because I still work there, and it's basically everything I write is pretty much blue collar, working class, and I guess it's defined by, I guess you'd call it grit lit. But the main character, Miles Knox, is based off of my time in a factory, things I dealt with, people, stories, every little thing you can imagine. There's even an explosion in there that I had to live through the explosion. But the other part of the character, he's a Vietnam veteran, which is based on my dad being a Marine. In the Vietnam War, he served in Da Nang, and basically this character, it's 30 years after. It's like early 2000, right after y'all had the hurricane down here, because we got the excess of the winds that came up from the south up to the north and came through Indiana and tore a bunch of stuff up. And that's a small part of the book. I had one guy who read it tell me, man, this book is really windy. I was like, because as you go through drafts, I thought that became less and less of a character for the book, but it's still kind of stuck there because it was kind of slowly building up. There's a storm coming. But it's all the horrors that Miles Knox has to deal with, like the trauma of war, the people he's seen lost, because a lot of the interviews I did with my dad, anything that dealt with the war, it came from my dad and actual situations that he was in. He was in a box mine explosion because he was a mine sweeper. So he swept the roads every day from the different bases that led to tanks. He was part of a tanker brigade. They called them combat engineers. When he first told me he was an engineer, I was like, oh, wow, you could like go out and build buildings and stuff like that, huh? He's like, no, I wasn't that kind of an engineer. But you had like 15 engineers per combat division. And the book kind of centers on the aftermath that he just keeps dealing with, this trauma that he's never had to deal with, and all these other little things that go on. And he's dating a younger woman. He's fighting age, so he does steroids and he lifts weights because he wants to stay younger, because I feel like that's what we kind of do as we get older. We're always trying to make ourselves look better with exercise, wrinkle cream, whatever, we just want to, watching our diet more, realize we can't eat certain things. But, the side effect with him is he still drinks whiskey and smokes cigarettes, but he exercises like a horse, It's kind of a wild crime story, because he dates a younger woman who's a stripper, and she may or may not have been involved in the murder of a drug dealer. So it gets kind of crazy.
So something that I get asked all the time, and I think you guys probably do too, when you write what we write, is, are you okay? Right? So I'm really curious what brought both of y'all to Gritlit. Like, why not romance or comedy?
You mean it? I can go. Just for me, I guess masculinity, just like you write femininity, But I've tried to explain this to people that, as far as masculinity goes, it wasn't just like, you talk about the patriarch, which I wrote a piece about that or talked about it. It wasn't just that my father or my grandfather, they were head of the household, but there was a woman there that was helping out. It wasn't just one guy carrying the load. It was kind of a team effort. My grandfather had a farm and worked in town and ran the farm. But my grandmother was taking care of the kids, cooking, and he was a huge hunter, so he had all these hound dogs on the farm, and she's feeding his dogs when he's at work, and then he's feeding them in the evenings. It was just it was a group effort. So, yeah, I'm okay.
But like, you just wanted to tell that story. That's what led you to write it.
I never really thought of it being defined as more. The thing that I guess that brought me to write the way that I write was Larry Brown, who's from Mississippi in Oxford. And when I discovered Larry Brown, I was like, I've said this before, what was going on in Mississippi was going on in Indiana, because I knew the same people that he knew, and I didn't realize I could write about them. So then I started writing about them, because, of course, Larry never wrote about meth, but I was like, I know a lot of people who have lost their, I don't want to say they lost their lives, but they lost their livelihood to meth, coming from cooking it and everything else and selling it and just destroying their lives. And people that I ran with when I was younger, before meth was even a thing. I ran around with a guy who was from the West Coast who used to get, his family got meth in the mail because they sold it. And it wasn't the redneck crank that people make and sell. It was actual stuff coming up from Mexico up to the West Coast, and they had contacts out there. Of course, I was a kid, didn't realize all this till later, but it was like running around with him was like being at the Sons of Anarchy. I don't know if you all ever watched that family unit. That's how that family was, and I got kind of involved with them as being accepted. So I wrote about it later on, but that's before I started writing. So yeah, but I never thought about it, a term of being grit lit. I just always thought of it as blue collar working class fiction, more or less. Yeah.
What about you, Daren?
But it is gritty. So
Yeah.
that's
Yeah.
Well, we were kind of talking about this a little bit last night, and I guess there's a lot of different directions you could take it, but I would say to try to define grit lit, I think it goes back to Harry Crews. There's certainly gritty novels that started that for years, and you could go back a long way and go, that's kind of grit lit. But it really, I think, starts with Harry Crews, and in his autobiography, A Childhood, the most uninspired title for a book.
it's amazing.
But an amazing book.
It's an
Yeah,
amazing
awesome.
book.
Incredible
Yeah.
book. But he says in there, I am a grit. And he was talking about growing up in like the 30s and how poor. I remember he would say things. It was kind of a characteristic of the way he talked. He would say things and you're like, is he serious or is that funny? I was always like, it's funny, but is he serious?
It's
But
true.
he would-
That's the thing.
He would say
there's
something
that,
like,
that comedy and truth. Yeah.
he would say something like, the women where I'm from, they were all toothless by 30. And then you're like, wow, oh crap, It's true.
And
but
his
the way
mother,
he-
his mother
delivery-
chewed snuff.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
But I remember he said when it comes to writing what he wrote, he struggled like a lot of people did. He said, I was embarrassed of my background back then, and I wanted to climb out of it. And I went into the military. When I got out, I took the GI Bill and I went to college. And I wanted to get out of the lower class grit family I was in. I was embarrassed of it. But he said, so I wrote and I wrote and I wrote, and it was all terrible because I was pretending to be something I wasn't. And I kind of went through the same thing too, where I changed the way I talked. I tried to change the words that I used, and it just kind of evolved from there. And I went to college, and then I realized we moved around a lot. I was alienated from my own family because I moved around. Then when I got older, my education, I felt like alienated me from my own family because they'd say, oh, Daren's smart. Listen to the words he uses. And then I'd say, well, I'm the same level of intelligence as I was back then as I am now. No, you're different now. And I think it is that feeling of alienation, even from the time I was a young person. But I'll tell this story real quick. Last night, I have a brother who was born mentally handicapped, and he couldn't communicate. He's died a couple of years ago. He couldn't speak. We never really knew how much he understood or didn't. And back in the 70s, when we were kids, 60s and 70s, the state was reforming. They were all about reforming. You couldn't at that time keep your child home with you. They had to be in a state school. And so my mom got the letter. That was a big surprise to her. She thought she was going to be taking care of my brother for the rest of his life at home, right? And I remember in my kid's mind, I wanted to communicate with him, right? And I used to stare at him. We'd lay down on the floor and play, and I'd look at him. And I was trying to mentally communicate with him. And I just knew one day he was going to hear my voice, and I was going to hear his voice. And I think they always talk about with writing self-expression, right? Self-expression's part of it, but I think another big part of it is communication, right? And because I didn't come from a family that, at least when I was young, even a hug was not something that they did. It was more like one of my uncles who spent a lot of time in and out of jail. He would say, when he saw me, even now, if I saw him, he'd say the same thing. He'd say, Daren, I'll take you out back and whoop your ass. That was his way of saying, I love you.
I'm just fascinated by like writers' sort of like origin villain stories, because I never wanted to be a writer. I was a teacher and a big reader until I had children, and then I had really terrible postpartum depression, and my therapist sort of directed me to writing to find community. She also gave me drugs, just for the record. She's a very responsible therapist. But I just really was tired of like lying about how I was, right? Motherhood was terrible, and my body was ripped in half, and my kids are screaming, and everybody you meet tells you how blessed you are, and you're like, well, yeah, like obviously I love my children, but this is not really good times. But I couldn't pretend like it wasn't, and I was so tired of lying that I just was like, I just have to get it all out on the page. And I see that in both your work too. Like, it just, like, let's not pretend, let's just get it all out there. And I think that in doing that, we create a community where people, not only trust you because you're telling the truth, but also they can see themselves in you. I've never worked in a factory, but I can see myself in Frank's work. I've never lived in Missouri. I can see myself in Daren's work. It's really special that way, I think, when you're not afraid to be honest.
Yeah, I mean, everything I write is pretty much, it comes from family folklore, history, or things, but I just never realized you could write about that, gosh. There's not a story or a book that I've written that I didn't pull from my well, So, yeah. It's kind of interesting. I mean, like growing up, like you were talking about Harry Crews, talking about, being poor. I mean, my grandparents were poor. My parents were poor because everybody had to work, but you didn't realize it because you had that wealth of community and family, because you always had the country style picnics throughout the summer. Friends were always there because we always hunted on the weekends, depending on what was in season, whether that was deer, rabbit, squirrel. My grandfather was an avid raccoon hunter. So, like I said, he had a lot of hound dogs. So I always grew up around dogs. Just, you always had all these other things that replaced, you didn't need money, if that makes sense, And then as I got older and got into mischief and drinking and drugs and things like that, and run around wild people, then your grandparents are like, I know I raised you better than that. But, like for us, we would steal eggs from the hen house and then go out at night and egg cars that drove down the road that ran past, because it's old country road, but not thinking that your grandparents' house is right behind you all. Who's not going to know that it was their grandkids doing this to the cars, or corn. We would feed corn and throw at cars. Just silly little things like that. But you don't realize you can write about it. I never thought I never thought about being a writer when I was younger. It was just one of those things that happened.
Until Harry Crews, or?
No, I was started reading books on night shift when I was in the factory around, gosh, I'd always read nonfiction, and probably around late 20s. I read Chuck Palahniuk, and I ended up liking all of his books, and he had this minimalist style. And I started looking at other minimalists, and Larry Brown was one of them. So I picked up Big Bad Love. I picked up Joe, Father and Son, Faye. Facing the Music was really hard to find, and I found it, and I was just kind of blown away. And then I got his books of essays, Billy Ray's Farm, and then Fire, and then he put out The Rabbit Factory. And then The Miracle of Catfish came after he passed away. But I remember it was like 2004. I was on night shift. We were getting ready for Thanksgiving. And I was like, man, he hasn't put anything out in a while. And it came across the wire when I'm looking on my phone that he passed away. And I was like, shit, I'm never going to meet this guy. This is a guy that influenced me. So then I was kind of, it's kind of heartbreaking. But I mean, he turned me on to people like Tom Franklin, William Gay, later on Daniel Woodrell. Harry Crews came later, Cormac McCarthy. I read a little bit of everything. I'm a big Charlie LaDuff, I'm big on journalism. I love him. But yeah.
Which writer was it for you, Daren?
Well, it wasn't just one writer. There was a lot of writers even today that I read. I read a wide variety in this idea that grit lit is only about gratuitous violence or whatever. It's not all that, I don't think, because it covers the way we are as human beings. So when I first heard that the festival had chosen Other Voices, Other Rooms by Truman Capote as their one read or community read. I forget what their term is. I was like, yeah, I remember being 15, 16 years old and reading that book. All of the homosexual stuff went over my head, but I recognized those characters, and I recognized the fact that this kid now had to live with other family, and I was like, that's my life too. And I had a library copy of it. It had Truman Capote. Before, I had no idea who he was. I didn't know he was this ostentatious, bombastic person. I just remember they used a picture of him when he was probably a teenager in a white t-shirt, looking cool, and I was like, oh, this is a great book. I love this book, and that was one of the first books I read where I felt like I could empathize. But a lot of times I read writers and I go, I love that. I love Roberto Bolaño, the Chilean writer. I can't write like him, but I love his work. I love Bonnie Jo Campbell.
Yeah, Bonnie's
There's
really good.
Anne Pancake. There's a bunch of women writers. I just love their work. I teach a lot of African-American writers because I teach at a HBCU back in Missouri. But Frank and I think all three of us are similar, some of the influences. I remember reading Flannery O'Connor. That was the one that really blew me away. In college, I read Flannery O'Connor, and I said, who has been hiding Flannery O'Connor from me? They've hid her from me. Because they wouldn't teach it in high school, because it's too controversial about religion and everything. I was so mad. And I read everything she wrote, and then I started like, can I write a Flannery O'Connor type story? I tried that. I was like, sort of, but it's not very good, but okay. I tried all kinds of stuff, but then really same thing. When I first read Larry Brown, the way he looked and what people he was writing about, I was like, he looks just like my uncle.
Yeah.
He talks just like my uncle, one of my uncles. And then I had that same kind of Harry Cruz realization where I'm like, you are kicking against what you are. You've tried so hard to cover that up, but that is who you are. And you can't write about the campus novel, although you might love Stoner by John Williams, but you can't write that. That's not who you are. You got to write about those people. That's what you know. The kind of people who are, some of them were great people, some of them were looking for trouble all the time, and that's the people.
I love that you brought up Anne Pancake and Bonnie, and we were talking about Dorothy Allison last night.
Yes. Yes.
Because I love the honesty of Gritlit, but lady Gritlit writers are outnumbered probably 5 to 1. And so I love Harry Cruz and I love Larry Brown. I don't love their representations of women in their book. And when I wanted to write, it was hard. It was harder to find. But then you find like Bastard Out of Carolina and your life changes, right? And it all of a sudden doesn't really become about gender anymore. It's about people. But there's just...
Yeah, and it's a time period too. It's not necessarily that they're being misrepresented. It's just how it was during that time period. A lot of those people have written like Father and Son by Larry Brown. It's written back, I think, like in the early 60s.
Yeah, and I don't think that it's a misrepresentation. I think it's
just the way it was.
We all write from our own
during
experience.
That culture, right?
And so, he just maybe didn't know the same kind of women that I know. That's all.
Well, you're probably not. I mean, it's going to be different.
Right, we're 50 years later.
Right.
Yeah, this is something I try to explain sometimes, but it's not very popular when I try it, is because I'm not in lockstep with what's happening in our culture, obviously. But I will say, like if I'm writing about something that happened in the past, I didn't know people who were worrying about how it made you feel. They're like, oh, you feel like shit when I said that? Good, that's what I fucking intended.
Well, it's true. I mean, if you're going to hold something back, then you're not going to express the truth of what you're writing about, because if you're writing from a certain place, a time period, and the roots of where you come from, you have to understand that time period. You can't mask it because then you're lying to yourself and you're lying to the reader. I never think about the reader. I just figured that if somebody I like what I write, and if somebody else likes it, then hey, we're on the same page. That makes a connection regardless of we come from different places. We can meet in the middle and form new ideas, that kind of thing. It helps us understand each other better.
Right, right.
Yeah.
Like the way I operate in my life every day now it's so different than it was. I'm 55 years old, so even 15 years ago it was different. 20 years ago, when I was a kid, it was way different. The people I was around, I have students who will say, refer to me as they. So I say, yes, I will do that. Or refer to me, however they want me to. I try to be very respectful. But in my writing, sometimes I'm not writing about people, those kind of people. And I think, as well-intentioned as it all is, sometimes people don't understand the distinction. They don't want to recognize the distinction because it's like sometimes it's a political stance. So they say, well, if it was that way, it shouldn't have been, and that was wrong. And I'm like, I'm not saying it's right. I'm not championing murder, and I'm not championing, I'm all for peace and love and all of those things and respect. But at the same time, what shaped me was those people that, for better and sometimes for worse, it was a school of hard knocks, and it was about being tough. Now, I hear students all the time. They bring me their papers. They'll say, I have this disability. I have that disability. I have this disability. Well, I can remember being younger, and I'm like, if you have any kind of disability, you better not tell anyone, because you're going to get your ass kicked, or you're going to get picked on, or you're going to be treated terrible. And so I would have loved to have been able to say, I'm scared, or,
Sure.
something like that. But it just wasn't, except with just a very small number of people,
Sure.
like your mother, someone's grandmother who took care of people. You could say those things to people like that. And there were men you could say things like that to. But you certainly didn't go to school or apply for a job and say, oh, by the way, I can't read. Oh, by the way, I have this disability. You're telling them, don't hire me. You're telling them you're weak. And I think there's it's difficult, So I think that's where the gritlet thing comes in. Trying to be true to what was, but not glorifying it and not saying that was right. That's definitely, I'm not trying to justify anything.
Right.
So if you don't think, I too don't think about the reader, right? Because you can't write with a reader on your shoulder.
You never get the book done.
No, God, no. But what I'm, my new collection that's out is like intensely personal. So, do you guys have the oh my God, what the fuck did I do? The week before it comes out the way that I do? Because now all y'all can buy my dirty laundry out there in the tent. Is that, because yours is like your family story, right? Like, are you?
No. It is what it is. Once it's out there, then I can move on. I'm always ready to move on to the next project, honestly.
Okay.
Yeah.
That's smart.
That's just me, though. I'm working on 2 nonfiction books because I get tired of writing fiction because basically all I'm doing is pulling from what I know. So why not just, here's everything that happened. So, yeah,
Right.
But now, a lot of your stuff is kind of centered around or like Appalachia,
Mm-hmm.
So where does all that come from?
Well, I live there.
Right.
And so I just I think because I became a writer there and I wanted to write about, people that I knew from the grocery store and my kids' friends. And so it's probably laziness more than anything that just.
Well, no, it's a region that should be written about.
Well, but as since I'm not a born Appalachian, I'm always very nervous, because I don't want to speak for anyone,
Well, no, but you can go out in the culture and meet the people and spend time with them and learn about them.
Yeah.
That's what writing's all about.
That's what I hope. And I've lived there for 20 years. And I think rural people are rural people everywhere. There's so many similarities between the rural people that I live with now and the rural people that I grew up with. The fierce independence, and the role of religion and the role of family, and all of the shenanigans that we got in as kids with the eggs and the corn. And
Sure.
I don't think our urban friends have quite the same experience.
They don't. That's what we were talking last night, because I grew up on a farm, basically. My grandparents had this 100-acre farm, and my step-grandfather's brother lived next to them and had another 100 acres, and he had a cousin that lived next to them and had another 100 acres, so we had like 300 acres to play on. And then my grandmother would go out and yell for us. We'd never hear her, but, we would steal matches from the house and go out and build fires and forts and everything else. But, we didn't realize that, when I say we, me and my cousins, because we're always running around, we would go to school and you would get the kids that lived in town and we would talk about things. It was kind of like, oh, we don't do that, or we've never done this, or we've never been fishing, we've never skinned a squirrel, or we've never been rabbit hunting, or dug fishing worms out of the ground to go fishing, or go wade fishing, or go swimming in the river. We go to the pool. It was just like a different world they didn't have any like culture, I guess is what I'm going to say. They didn't know about any of these things, so it's kind of like we had all these things to talk about, and it's like they sit around and watch TV or rode their bike around the block or something. It's like, well, we got trails to ride on, or gravel, or that kind of thing. So it was just a really different culture experience.
I moved to the Toronto area for undergrad, and my roommate was like shocked that you could hit a deer with your car. And I was like, not only can you hit a deer with your car accidentally, you can hit a deer with your car on purpose to feed your family.
You can.
And they were like,
I wrote a story for the New York Times about it.
Well, and I had friends and my you would pick up fresh roadkill because it's real meat, and that's how you feed your family, and that's a whole different experience than somebody who grows up in poverty in an urban area.
Sure.
But it's the same in Appalachia or Southern Appalachia as it was in Northern Ontario, and those connections are really, I don't know, I'm really refreshed by that. We have more in common than we have differences, and how nice is that, right? When the whole world is so divided, that we have more in common than we are different.
Yeah, it's just a matter of people talking.
Right.
Instead of screaming and hollering because you don't agree with them. Everybody has a side, but that's why you meet in the middle. But yeah.
Well, here's a good question for you guys, because this is another thing, writers get asked this all the time, is where do you get your ideas? Because right now we're talking about influences and family and people we knew, but what about the fictional element? Because for whatever reason, when you write fiction and then you do a presentation or something, everyone wants to know about, what's real? What part of it is real? They want to know but I'm thinking, well, the story that I wrote, that's the good part, the amalgamation of the people and the language and everything else. So where do you guys get your ideas for fiction? You take, I know sometimes I'll take 3 people I know, their characteristics, and make one person for fiction. And then someone will say, oh, I know him, that's old so-and-so. And I'm like, I don't know that guy, but,
Go ahead.
Well, I just get obsessed with things. I think the novel that my agent has right now, I was in a super divey diner in Sevierville, Tennessee, and this woman walked in and she had a real dramatic port wine stain on her face. And I just could not stop thinking about how much different her life is than my life. Because, fake eyelashes and always on a diet and all the makeup and whatever, and trying to look a certain way, and she's never, I wondered if that was a freedom, right, in that, or if it was a hardship, and I just kind of couldn't stop thinking about her. But sometimes it comes from the news, especially small town newspapers are the very best. I get so many ideas from this little newspaper in Ohio called the Scioto Valley Guardian, because it's just they find bodies in Rubbermaid tubs, and this woman stabbed her husband with an antler from a deer, and I was like, oh, these are all fucking gold, right? That's just gold right there. And so you just get obsessed, I think, and then my personal filter ends up on top of it.
Gotcha.
What about you, Frank?
Gosh, mine basically comes from everything I know, and I always relate it to what's going on in the world because I'm a news junkie. I read both sides of the news, listen to podcasts, and have thousands of conversations with all the guys I work with at work. We're constantly discussing things. And my best friend's a cop, so a lot of anything that deals with law enforcement in my books always comes from me doing ride-alongs with him. And but the nonfiction book that I'm working on deals with is a working class family from back in the 2000s that was basically on the cusp of technology, but they had their hand in just about everything, from doctor shopping for OxyContin to stealing car stereos, stealing amps to the car stereos, stealing the speakers, stealing marijuana, stealing ATM machines. Gosh, they were in a little bit of everything. And their father built a house, or not built a house, but he was basically a construction worker who they contracted on the side. But basically, these people would get up and decide on, get my cup of coffee, snort a line, and decide on who are we going to rob today and what's our scheme. And it was from the grandmother to the son to the grandsons and whatever they had. It just, each one did something different. They were kind of like a gang. And when my best friend became a cop, he had a place that got robbed one night, and they didn't know it because the ATM machine had gotten busted out of a mom and pop place. And he gets a call at 5:30 in the morning when he's getting ready to get off at 6. Hey, we got a place to get robbed. And it's like, well, the alarm didn't go off. So he goes over and sees everything that happened. ATM machine's gone. And at that time, this is early 2000, the police at that time, for like, we live in a county, so you had all these little towns. Nobody didn't have the internet basically, not like we do now. So nothing was connected on the mainframe. So now, like, if something, because you all live in parishes, like if something happened here, got busted, somebody in another parish can know about it because they're looking for that person. Back then they didn't know, because we were in the counties. So he tells me about this robbery and what he thinks is going on, and then when he finds out about it, there was a detective that been working this family for like 3 or 4 years, and it became one of what it turned into was one of the biggest RICO cases in that area. Whenever they put it all together, the FBI came in, and I basically got to sit down with the detective who's now retired and has all the paperwork and newspaper clippings and everything to tell me about this family. But what I did, because it's hard to sell just like, hey, here's a true crime story. What I've done is take pieces of my life of people that I ran around with that were like this family, and I tie those stories into them. As I'm telling their story, I'm telling my own story. So, yeah, because I used to do a lot of shady stuff. So. But it's interesting, I mean, we all live and learn. I mean, I could tell you 1,000 stories that are funny, and I just didn't get in trouble. But
Well, I had a lot of friends like that too. And I would
and
ask
it makes
people,
for good writing. I mean,
well, I would ask what happened to so and so, and they're like, "Well, he's in jail." I'm like, "Oh."
yeah, well, that's the other side, is that, you run around with these people and they all turned out bad. And, I was always looked at like, you don't want to run around with him. He's not going to turn out good. I turned out okay and they didn't. So, that's the other side of it.
Well, I think about this a lot since I also teach writing. So I have to not just, sometimes someone's good at something, even writing, and they can't always teach someone else how to do it. And that goes with anything. I'm good at this, but here's how you do it. How do you do it? Well, I don't know. It just comes natural, right? Like, I'm just good with numbers or whatever it is, So I think a lot about how to communicate to my students, something that's going to make sense to them and help them. And if I didn't teach, I don't think I would think about these things, but as much as I have. But what I think good writers do, and everybody up here does this, is you'll take the average, something that seems like something in your own life you would say this isn't really important, no one else would be interested in it, right? But you don't realize how unique your life really is from someone else's perspective, right? And I think what a good writer does is they elevate, like when we're writing about, say, blue collar or even poor, very poor people, you take their life and you elevate it to the level of art. And I think that's what a good writer does. And then it resonates with the reader, right? Because they say, I recognize that. That is me. If you read a really good book, and I've done this many, many times, and I'm sure everyone in here has done this, when you read a really good book and you say to yourself, that is me, right? That's a metaphor, right? That, not I am like that, But when you read about a character you really resonate with, you say, that is me. How did she know that is me? How did he know? How did that writer know that is me? Right? And for that moment, you're living in that elevated world that the writer created. And it's a give and take, right? It's a give and take between the reader and the writer. There's a synaptic gap that has to be jumped, the electricity, right? The writer writes the book. If no one reads it, who cares, right? But if a reader reads it and then there's a reaction, right? This completes it jumps from one nerve to the next, right? And now you read it and you say, that is me, right? That is not like me. And that's why you want this ecstatic experience. I was talking about this last night. My great uncle, I lived with him for 3 or 4 years. He was I always say, holy roller preacher. And then some people are like, I believe you mean that he was whatever, I say, well, no, he was a holy roller lay preacher and speaking in tongues, laying on of hands. People would say, oh, do people, I heard that there are people come to your church and they roll around on the floor. Is that right? And my great uncle used to say, yeah, that's right. And there's room for you too. Right? And, but what I learned from it, my mom was a bartender. And so sometimes I would hang out with my mom, and during the day as a kid, you could go to the bar. Yep. And I played pinball. I got my name up on the high score. I played the pinball machine so much. Play pool with the truckers that came in and see the bar flies that hang out there every day and just drink all day long. And then I realized one day, I said, some of these people are a lot nicer than the people I met in church who think you don't do anything right. I remember one time a lady said, those children on the front row are chewing gum. And she was so angry about it, right? And then the preacher said, those are the temple of the Holy Ghost, right? That's the temple of God. So it's okay. They can chew gum, And I just remember thinking, that's what you're looking for when you read a book, right? Every time you pick up a book, you're saying, how can I have an ecstatic experience? And that's a Greek word that means to stand outside of yourself, ecstasy. Who wouldn't trade everyday normal experience for ecstasy, right? And that's why we pick up the books. That's why I write.
Well, that's the power of books, right, is the empathy, that we can connect with other people and experience their experiences and realize that we're similar. Like Frank's book, Back to the Dirt, you need to buy it. It's an incredible book, but it's about a veteran with PTSD, and he's lifts weights and works out and takes a lot of steroids and is dating a younger woman, and that has nothing to do with my life. But I have CPTSD, and I can see myself in that character, and it's amazing the power of books. And
yeah, you take you take your something simple and you make it interesting, basically, and you add the layers to it. Mm-hmm. Conflict. I think that's something Larry Brownlee said. You throw the kitchen sink at the character and you just keep throwing it at them. That's what makes something interesting. But that's how life is. When you think about it, it's just one bad thing after another some days. I run out of gas. I get gas in my car. Now I got a flat tire. I fix the tire. I got no money to fix the tire. The engine blows up, and my wife's in the hospital, and she's going to have a baby, and I can't get there. I mean, it's kind of that simple because those things happen.
Yeah. Definitely. I did a reading at Western Carolina University, and I read a story that's inspired by my cousin who took his life, and I had this girl just come up to me after and just sob on my shoulder for 10 minutes because that's the power of empathy, right?
Right.
Like she saw herself in that story, and that's just wild to me that we get to do this as a job. We get to make these connections and create legacy. If you guys were in here listening to Maurice talk earlier, this building will be destroyed someday, but our books will exist still, and that's pretty cool.
We hope.
Yeah, my dad, I didn't really grow up around him, but over the years, I realized he's the toughest man that ever lived, you know. At least every story he would tell would be about him having a physical fight with someone. I never saw him mad about anything. And everyone would tell me, oh, you're just like your dad. You got a temper just like your dad. And I'm like, well, my dad's not huge, but he's bigger than me. I'm like, well, it's a good thing I'm not very big because I do have a bad temper, right? But John Gardner, you know, he said, fiction is the only religion I have, right? And I always liked that line because I don't think he meant it literally, but I felt like I knew what he meant when he said it because it's become now a part of my everyday life. And so a lot of times people will say, well, if I just had the time, I'd be a writer too. If I just had the time, I'd write a book. And I'm like, well, you must not be a writer. You must be a reader because nobody has, I have the same amount of time as you, right? Which is to say, you spend time doing what you want to do, and that's fine, you know. But I remember I was reading, I love to read about religions, like Eastern religions and all these, and philosophies and things like that. And I remember I was reading something that had to do with Eastern religion and kind of something that Joseph Campbell said. Alan Watts actually asked Joseph Campbell. He said, "Okay, Campbell, what's your religion? What's your religion? You know, I know you grew up Catholic, but what's your religion?" And he said, "My religion is underlining words in a book." All right. I was like, that's a pretty good religion.
Do you write any creative nonfiction, Daren?
No.
Because I started
very rarely. Very rarely.
I started there, and my husband was like, "Can you please stop airing our dirty laundry?" And so I was like, "Okay, well, I'll just make it fiction." And you're moving from fiction to some nonfiction projects, right?
Yeah, I mean, when I first got my first 2 books published, my editor always wanted me to write nonfiction for different journals or newspapers. And I wrote a couple of pieces for the New York Times and Grana and the Daily Beast. And working a day job, well, I work night shift, but working a job, it's kind of hard to do book promotion, write another book, and write nonfiction. But yeah, I mean, one of the pieces, because you were talking about like how people, your rural community has to get food sometimes. One of the things I'd written about for the New York Times when they reached out, they were wanting to talk about, I think, deer season or something. But anyway, it was, well, do you have a story that would kind of go with the times of what was going on? I can't remember exactly what it was, but there was a story that my aunt and my step-grandfather were out horseback riding on the farm up in the woods, and it was deer season, and my grandfather seen this huge buck deer go stumbling down the hill. And for whatever reason, I guess they needed meat, so he jumps off the horse and doesn't have a gun or anything, and he ends up pulling up a fence post, a cedar fence post, and rips the fence off of it, and he starts beating the deer in the head as it's going over the hill. And my aunt was like, all I could hear was thump, thump, and it kept getting further and further away, and then it got quiet, and he comes back up the hill, and he said, take the other horse, go back to the house, and call Frank, which is my dad, I'm a junior, and tell him to bring his bow, because bow season was in. So she goes back to the house, calls my dad, tells him to, and to meet on my brother's property. That was the other thing, so they come in the back way. So my dad ends up showing up, and my dad said they walk in the back part of the property where here's all these hunters up in these trees in their deer stands waiting for a deer to come through. And here he comes walking through with his bow and my step-grandfather. And then about 10 minutes later, they come back dragging a deer out. But that was what they needed meat. That's what my dad said. That was like one of the biggest deers that he's ever seen killed. But he said it had apparently been shot several times and survived it because it had a lot of bad scar tissue and stuff on the meat. But in the kitchen of my grandparents' house, I always wondered because that fence post was up on a little thing. If you go into like the old farmhouses, a lot of people, because they hunted and stuff, they'd always have their rifles over each entrance to the doorways throughout the house. And in the kitchen, they took the one gun down and put up the fence post.
Oh my God.
And it was a story I never got all the everything from until I get hold of my aunt to talk to her about it. I get hold of my dad. My dad started crying. He was laughing so hard he'd forgotten all about it because they get to the deer and he's like, "What do you want me to do?" And my grandfather's like, "Stick it. Take the arrow out and stick it in the deer." And he's like, "I can't just stick it." He's like, "Keep the damn arrow." Sticks it, and that's what he said. That he just come dragging that deer out like 10 minutes later. And there's always people like looking like, "How in the hell did they kill a deer so fast? We've been here all morning." But, yeah. But that's one of those things.
Ingenuity.
Yeah, and then they took it back and field dressed it and everything. Yeah.
Oh my God.
Well, hey, should we, we've got about 10 minutes left. Should we take questions? Do we want to do that, or that'd be something?
Oh wow.
Would you consider Raymond Carver?
I wouldn't. I love Raymond Carver, but I wouldn't consider him exactly Gritlit now. Well, I think he's much more sophisticated. I know back in the 80s and maybe even into the 90s, Carver was a minimalist,
Yeah.
right? He didn't write a lot about violence. Actually, he wrote a lot about him and his wife and all their fights, that they had, their domestic problems, but he did in a beautiful way. I mean, he was so influential that this is why people to this day criticize MFA programs, because back in the 80s, everyone was trying to write the perfect Raymond Carver minimalistic story where you had the epiphany. It was just, and beautifully worded, and really maybe not even minimalistic at that point, but a Gritlit, I think, is more about, tends to be more about, it doesn't have to be only, and certainly not just the South. We've got Indiana, we've got, I'm from Missouri. I might have been influenced by a lot of Southern writers, but there's a lot of Midwestern, it's all over really, what I think Gritlit is, but it tends to deal more with the blue collar people and poor people.
Down on their luck.
Down on their luck.
Struggling to get by, human condition. Yeah.
But that's a good question. What would you say? What would you guys say about Raymond Carver? I mean, maybe you might have a different perspective.
No, I agree with you about Raymond Carver. When I'm trying to explain it, I usually talk about like the depth of character from literary fiction mixed with sort of the excitement of genre fiction, like crime or horror, but always rural and working class or poverty. You don't see people with fancy cars or fancy phones or fancy houses. I write a lot of waitresses and, because that's what I know.
I like to juxtapose them sometimes where you have a professor speaking to a farmer or, and I think that's a good contrast sometimes. But
what do you think, Frank?
Yeah, I mean, you nailed it on the head. He was a minimalist. I've always looked at Gritlit as just, your working class blue collar people, or just down on your luck, struggling to get by, working as anything from a handyman to carpenter, working on cars, factory work. I mean, even a police officer in a sense. I mean, it's just one of those things. Or war veterans, that kind of thing. Yeah.
But I would say that the stakes are always usually a little bit higher than Carver. Where his is very like relationship based. Our work is usually more life or death or dismemberment, I guess. In case you guys didn't hear that, she was asking about whether there's sort of an aspect of nature, a relationship with nature that's worked into Gritlit. And I think so for my work. Place is really important, but I don't...
Yeah, sense of place. That's always important. Setting. I mean, even the as far as like the countryside, how it looks. I mean, it's always in mind. Whenever anything I've written, it's very important. Yeah.
And because I write a lot about Appalachia, and it's such a place that's defined by so much extraction of resources from the environment, it touches a lot of my work. But Daren, what about yours in Missouri?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I've written about a lot of places I've lived. I grew up moving around a lot, and And I was always fascinated by how people talked and what they, I had a neighbor here in Louisiana. I taught at LSU, and I for about 7 years, I lived down here. And one of my neighbors was from Texas, and I could hear him talk all day because when I first moved here, he said, let me ask you something. You ever live in the South before? He was from Texas. And I said, yeah, I lived in North Carolina. And he said, North Carolina? He said, you in the real South now, partner. And I always thought that was so hilarious. And then when he would say, I was stationed in Hawaii. He's an older guy. I was stationed in Hawaii. And it reminds me, so when you're writing about a place like here in Louisiana, you can't, if you don't mention that there's live oaks and Spanish moss, you must be blind, right? Mm-hmm. We don't have live oaks. We got pin oaks in Missouri. We've got oak trees, but you don't see Spanish moss because that stuff would die up there when it got cold. So it's definitely the animals, the landscape. In this book, even in roads, I have there's kind of a metaphor going on without me coming right out and saying it that equates the coyotes that the men kill out in a rural area like they're brothers or cousins almost, right? There's a relationship between them. They're just as wild as the coyotes in a different way, and maybe society and sometimes is as hard on them as they are on these coyotes, right? Yeah. Because they would, I knew people that would go out in the fall and ride around in their trucks and shoot every coyote and wild dog they could because they'd get after their cattle and their horses and
chickens,
yep. Especially chickens.
Mm-hmm.
Any it didn't matter whose dog it was. If it killed a chicken, and they knew that was the dog that did it, that was a dead dog. Yeah. So yeah, definitely rural landscape always goes into my stuff. Mm-hmm. Someone like William Gay. I love how he writes about landscape. He's incredible.
Definitely he's
Mm-hmm.
definitely, it's
Mm-hmm.
always it's like a secondary character in his books.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Court McCarthy's a lot like that too in some
Yeah.
of the things that he's written. Yeah.
He's the only one I can think of. He could write for pages and pages and pages about the landscape, and if I wrote it, they'd say, you're going to have to cut some of this out. No one wants to read that, but you read it and you're like, wow, Anything else? Any other question? Yeah.
I don't really have a question, but I'm from Baton Rouge. My parents are from South Louisiana. I'm married to a New Yorker. I live in New Jersey, and I'm a school librarian there. So I really appreciate the truth of what you guys write. Because having read not necessarily your work, but I'm reading your work now. And the difference between respect today for what we need and what everybody needs, but the truth of what we're writing about and your heritage and your stories. And I agree, the kids today don't have as much of those connections to their culture, their history, and just their communities to a certain degree. So I would say that a lot of what we write is fiction, but it really is truth of how things are and how things were. And I love the details and connections to the nature. And my mother was like, oh yeah, that was accurate. Those shrimpers were wearing white boots, not like those details that tell you. And I think that's what everybody connects with. That's what I connect with. Is just truth of your people and your stories, because they're the truth everywhere. And so I really appreciate what you guys do.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, no, I think that's one reason. I don't know. I don't want to speak for everyone, but I think that's one reason why I write for sure is this sense of trying to make connection because I grew up in such a disjointed way. Even what Frank is describing and someone like some of these writers we talk about, I felt like I missed the boat on that because we were constantly, my mom was kind of a hippie, or as you might say, I'm going to go live with this guy now and good luck to you and I'll see you on your birthday. And I was looking for that sense of connection. And I was always fascinated by people who said, I've lived here my whole life and I can't imagine living anywhere else. And I'm like, I can imagine it because I do it all the time. I've done it my whole life. But I always thought you could tell that they love it. When I read someone like Larry Brown, right? I go, that guy loves Mississippi. Me, if I'm like, well, I don't really feel that way about Missouri. It's part of who I am. But I always felt like Missouri didn't love me, right? Because I was poor. And so it's complicated, right? So I was looking for a sense of connection. And, when you have a grandfather, a father, a son, a grandmother, so on and so forth, I felt like I didn't know those people. I would see my own family members sometimes, the older ones, they're all passed away now. They didn't even know my name sometimes. They'd say, that's Barb's son. And then I had a cousin who was real gregarious and outgoing, and he'd tell lies all the time.
Don't know your name, but they know how much you've grown.
Yeah. Yeah. And he'd say, people used to say with my cousin, they'd say, when I was a kid, they'd say, because he was so gregarious, they'd say, that's Malcolm's cousin.
Yeah.
Right? I felt like I was a movie camera recording all the time, and I think that's how I became a writer.
Right.
Very cool. Well, I think our time is up, y'all, but thank you so much for hanging out with us.
Thank you.